I was always drawn to train journeys. Something about the rhythmic clatter of wheels against steel tracks lulled me into a sense of calm, making the hours pass effortlessly. So, when my boss suggested a company retreat 2 states away, I volunteered to take the train rather than fly. It would give me time to catch up on reading and clear my head. The morning of the journey, the station was a whirlwind of commuters. Announcements echoed overhead as I made my way to the platform, juggling my overnight bag and a coffee cup. My train was the 7:15 Express, a sleek silver bullet of a machine that promised speed and comfort. I had booked a seat in the last carriage, hoping for a quieter ride. When I boarded, I noticed the carriage was almost empty, save for a couple seated near the middle and a man dozing by the window toward the back. I chose a window seat 3 rows ahead of him, placing my bag on the seat beside me. The air conditioning hummed softly, and the faint smell of upholstery cleaner lingered in the air. The train pulled out of the station smoothly, gaining speed as the cityscape blurred into rolling fields. I opened my book, a well-worn paperback thriller, but my attention wavered. Instead, I found myself gazing out the window, watching the scenery rush past. There was something mesmerizing about the way the world seemed to stretch and compress with the train's motion. About an hour into the journey, I noticed the man at the back of the carriage stirring. He stood, stretched, and started walking toward me. As he passed, he nodded a polite hello. I returned the gesture and thought little of it until I caught him hesitating by the carriage door, peering through the glass panel into the next car. He seemed uneasy, glancing back once before disappearing into the adjoining carriage. It wasn't long after that the couple began whispering to each other, their voices just audible over the train's hum. They kept looking toward the door the man had used, then at me. I tried to focus on my book, but the weight of their furtive glances made it impossible. Eventually, the woman leaned over to her companion, whispering something that prompted him to stand. He approached me cautiously, his face etched with discomfort. "Excuse me," he began, his tone apologetic. "Did you notice that man? The one who just left?" I nodded, closing my book. He explained that they had seen the man behaving strangely before boarding, muttering to himself and pacing the platform. The couple wondered if he might be unwell or if they should alert a conductor. I suggested they wait and see if he returned before deciding. They seemed reassured by my calm demeanor, but their unease lingered. The train sped on, stopping briefly at smaller stations where new passengers boarded, though few ventured to the last carriage. An elderly woman joined us at one stop, taking a seat near the front. A young man with headphones slouched into a corner at another. The carriage felt more alive now, the earlier stillness replaced by the soft murmurs of conversation and the occasional rustle of newspapers. It was during one of these stops that the man reappeared, his sudden presence jolting me upright. He looked disheveled, his shirt untucked and his hair damp with sweat. He scanned the carriage, his eyes darting from one passenger to another before settling on me. Without a word, he walked over and dropped into the seat across the aisle. "You didn't see anything, did you?" he asked abruptly, his voice low but urgent. His question caught me off guard, and I stammered a response, asking what he meant. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath before leaning closer. "The guy in the next carriage. You didn't see him, right?" I admitted I hadn't and asked why he was so concerned. He hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. Then, in a hushed tone, he explained that he had seen a man carrying what looked like a weapon wrapped in a jacket. He claimed the man had boarded at the last station and had been pacing the adjoining carriage, muttering to himself. My stomach tightened. The stranger's story sounded implausible, but his fear was palpable. I told him he should alert the train staff, but he shook his head vehemently. "I can't," he said. "What if I'm wrong? What if it's nothing?" Before I could respond, the train jolted sharply, throwing us against our seats. The lights flickered, and a collective gasp rippled through the passengers. An announcement crackled over the intercom. The conductor's voice strained as he explained there was a technical issue requiring an emergency stop. We would be delayed for at least 30 minutes. The train ground to a halt in the middle of nowhere, fields stretching endlessly on either side. The hum of the engines faded, leaving an oppressive silence that heightened every creak and shuffle. Passengers began murmuring anxiously, and I noticed the couple from earlier exchanging worried glances. The elderly woman clutched her handbag tightly, her knuckles white. The man across from me leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "I'm gonna check it out. If something happens, tell them what I saw." Before I could protest, he stood and made his way toward the door. I watched as he disappeared into the next carriage, my pulse quickening. Minutes dragged by. I tried to focus on my book, but the words swam on the page. The atmosphere in the carriage grew tense, the passengers' unease feeding off one another. The young man with headphones stood abruptly, removing one earbud and glancing around nervously. He approached the couple, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out their words, but the couple's faces mirrored his alarm. And then we heard it, a muffled thud, followed by shouting. The sound came from the next carriage, sending a jolt through everyone. The elderly woman gasped, and the young man moved toward the door, hesitating before pushing it open. He peered through the glass panel, then turned back to us, his face pale. "Something's happening," he said, his voice shaking. We should move to another carriage." No one argued. We gathered our belongings hastily, the tension thick enough to choke on. As we filed out of the carriage, I couldn't resist glancing through the glass panel. The adjoining carriage was empty, save for a jacket crumpled on the floor. The man who had spoken to me was nowhere to be seen. We moved forward, joining the growing crowd of passengers congregating near the middle of the train. The conductor was making his way through, assuring everyone that the delay would be resolved soon. No one mentioned the strange noises or the missing passengers. It felt as if acknowledging them would make the situation more real. The train eventually lurched back into motion, the tension easing slightly as the familiar rhythm of the wheels resumed. But the man never returned, nor did anyone see him disembark at the subsequent stops. When I reached my destination, I reported the incident to the station authorities, but their responses were frustratingly vague. They promised to investigate but offered no immediate answers. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of unease that journey left me with. I still wonder about the man, the noises, and the crumpled jacket. And every time I board a train, I find myself glancing at the last carriage, half expecting to see him there, watching, waiting. Airports have always made me anxious, not because of flying, but because of the endless checkpoints, the confusing signage, and the sheer volume of people. They're places where you're never entirely in control, where you're shuffled like cattle from one line to the next, every move scrutinized. So when I found myself stuck in a foreign airport with a 6-hour delay, my nerves were already frayed. I was traveling home from a conference in Madrid, exhausted from 3 days of lectures and networking. My flight was scheduled for 2:45 p.m., but a thick fog had blanketed the city, grounding flights and sending the terminal into chaos. Gate 42 was packed with passengers, families, business travelers, students, all jostling for space. I found a corner near the windows, away from the worst of the crowd, and settled in to wait. The first couple of hours passed uneventfully. I distracted myself with my phone, scrolling aimlessly through news feeds and social media. Occasionally, announcements crackled over the intercom, but they were either in Spanish, which I didn't understand well, or vague reassurances that flights would resume soon. It was around the third hour that I noticed him. A man in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in a rumpled gray suit, pacing near the gate. Something about him caught my attention, the way he avoided eye contact, the way his hand lingered over his carry-on bag as if checking it was still there. He moved with a nervous energy, his eyes darting toward the security personnel stationed nearby. At first, I told myself he was just another stressed traveler. After all, who wasn't on edge in a situation like this? But as time passed, his behavior became harder to ignore. He approached the desk at gate 42 multiple times, speaking in hushed tones to the attendants, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his gestures were animated, almost frantic. When he finally sat down, it was across from me. His gaze flickered in my direction, then quickly away, as if he didn't want to be caught looking. I tried to focus on my phone, but my curiosity got the better of me. I glanced up occasionally, catching snippets of his muttered words, a mix of English and something else I couldn't place. He was joined an hour later by another man, younger, perhaps in his early 30s, wearing a leather jacket. They didn't exchange a greeting, but the tension between them was palpable. The younger man sat down beside the first, leaning in close to whisper something. The older man nodded, clutching his carry-on tighter. It was at this point that I started to feel uneasy. Their body language, the furtive glances, the hushed conversation, seemed off. I told myself I was overreacting, that I'd watched too many crime dramas, but a small voice in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. The turning point came when a family seated nearby decided to move to another gate. They'd been sitting near the two men, and I'd noticed the parents watching them nervously. As they gathered their things, the mother whispered something to her husband, who glanced toward the men and nodded grimly. They left quickly without looking back. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My gaze kept drifting to the two men, who were now speaking more animatedly. The younger one pulled out a phone, typing furiously before showing the screen to the older man. Whatever was on it made him blanch. The next announcement over the intercom was for my flight. Relief washed over me as passengers began lining up at the gate. I grabbed my bag and joined the queue, keeping an eye on the two men. They didn't move, though the older one's hand tightened on his bag. I couldn't tell if they were on my flight or waiting for another, but their tension seemed to escalate as the line dwindled. When I reached the boarding desk, I handed over my passport and ticket, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. As I stepped onto the jet bridge, I glanced back one last time. The two men were still seated, their heads close together, speaking in rapid whispers. I settled into my seat near the back of the plane, my nerves still jangling. The minutes dragged on as passengers filed in, stowing their luggage and buckling their seatbelts. The cabin crew made their rounds, checking overhead bins and offering reassurances about the delay. And then they boarded. The older man entered first, his eyes scanning the cabin before he shuffled down the aisle, his carry-on clutched tightly. The younger man followed close behind. My pulse quickened as they passed my row, taking seats 2 rows ahead. The older man placed his bag under the seat in front of him, his movements deliberate. I told myself it was a coincidence, that they had as much right to be on this flight as anyone. But I couldn't shake the gnawing sense of dread. I watched as the older man adjusted his bag, his hands trembling slightly. The younger man leaned over, whispering something that made him nod. The plane taxied to the runway, and I gripped the armrests, my mind racing. I considered alerting a flight attendant but hesitated. What could I say? That two men seemed suspicious? That they were whispering and clutching a bag? It wasn't exactly concrete evidence. As the plane took off, I kept a wary eye on them, my heart pounding with every passing minute. The older man's hand rested on his bag, his fingers drumming nervously. The younger man stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Slowly, my anxiety began to ebb. I felt foolish for letting my imagination run wild, for suspecting two strangers based on little more than gut instinct. By the time the plane began its descent, I had almost convinced myself that I'd overreacted. But as we landed and taxied to the gate, something unexpected happened. A team of uniformed officers boarded the plane, their expressions grim. They moved swiftly down the aisle, stopping at the row where the two men sat. Passengers craned their necks, whispering as the officers spoke in low tones to the men before escorting them off the plane. The older man's bag was left behind, and one of the officers carried it carefully, as if it were something fragile or dangerous. My stomach churned as I watched them disappear down the jet bridge. The flight attendants quickly reassured us that the situation was under control, but they offered no details. As I disembarked, I passed the row where the men had been seated. The bag was gone, but the tension lingered, a strange residue of whatever had transpired. I'll never know what was in that bag or what the men were planning, but the memory of that flight still haunts me. It's a reminder that sometimes your instincts aren't wrong, and that in a world as unpredictable as ours, it pays to stay vigilant. I've always loved road trips. There's something liberating about packing up your car, hitting the open road, and watching the scenery shift with every passing mile. But even the most well-planned trips can take unexpected turns, sometimes for the worse. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out. My destination was a small mountain town where my college roommate was getting married. The drive was supposed to take 6 hours, mostly along winding highways that cut through thick forests and sleepy rural towns. I had mapped out the route the night before and double-checked everything: snacks, playlists, and a full tank of gas. The first few hours were uneventful. The roads were clear, the sun was shining, and the foliage was breathtaking. A patchwork of reds, yellows, and oranges that seemed to glow in the morning light. I was making good time, cruising comfortably at the speed limit and singing along to my favorite songs. Around noon, I hit a detour. A section of the highway was closed for construction, and orange signs directed me onto a narrower road that snaked deeper into the forest. My GPS recalibrated, displaying a new route that would add about 30 minutes to my drive. It wasn't ideal, but I wasn't in a rush. The detour road was picturesque at first, a single-lane path bordered by towering trees that formed a golden canopy overhead. But as the miles stretched on, the road became rougher, its edges crumbling into loose gravel. The occasional house or barn I'd seen earlier disappeared, replaced by endless rows of trees. My GPS signal flickered, then cut out entirely, leaving me with no choice but to follow the road and hope it led back to the highway. An hour passed, then two. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. I hadn't seen another car since leaving the main highway, and my unease grew with every mile. The road's twists and turns became sharper, and I had to slow down to navigate safely. My gas gauge hovered just above empty, a cruel reminder of my dwindling options. When I saw the sign for a gas station, I almost cried with relief. It was an old, run-down place with peeling paint and a faded sign that read Jasper's General Store. The single pump looked ancient, but it would do. I pulled in and parked, stepping out of the car into the cool evening air. The store's door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew and motor oil. A man stood behind the counter, his face partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. He glanced up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Evening," he said, his voice gruff. "Need gas?" I nodded, explaining my situation. He gestured toward the pump outside, mentioning it was cash only. I handed over a couple of bills and returned to the pump, filling my tank as quickly as possible. The man watched me through the store's window, his gaze unsettling. Back on the road, I felt a surge of relief. With a full tank, I could keep driving until I found a more populated area. But the road seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in like walls. The sun had set completely now, and my headlights barely penetrated the inky darkness. It was then that I saw the car. It was parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking. As I approached, I noticed a figure standing beside it, waving their arms. A woman, alone, in the middle of nowhere. My first instinct was to stop. After all, she might need help. But something about the situation felt wrong. Her movements were erratic, almost frantic, and she kept glancing over her shoulder into the forest. I slowed down but didn't stop. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of her face, pale, wide-eyed, and streaked with tears. She shouted something, but the words were lost in the roar of my engine. My heart pounded as I continued driving, guilt warring with fear. What if she was in real trouble? What if I was her only chance? A mile down the road, I pulled over, my hands shaking. I debated with myself, replaying the scene over and over. Finally, I decided to turn back. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to her because I was too scared to help. When I reached the spot where I'd seen her, the car was gone. I slowed to a crawl, scanning the roadside for any sign of her. The hazard lights were off, and the area was eerily quiet. I rolled down my window, calling out into the darkness, but there was no response. Just the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. I drove on, my eyes darting between the road and the dense forest. That's when I saw it. A faint light flickering through the trees. It was far off the road, but unmistakable. Against my better judgment, I stopped and got out, grabbing the flashlight from my glove compartment. The forest was silent as I made my way toward the light, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted branches and patches of moss. The light grew brighter as I approached, resolving into the glow of a small fire. And then I saw them. 3 figures stood around the fire, their faces obscured by shadows. They didn't move or speak, their attention fixed on something on the ground between them. I crept closer, staying just beyond the circle of light, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. What I saw made me freeze. It was the woman from the roadside, lying motionless on the ground. Her eyes were closed, her face pale and still. One of the figures knelt beside her, reaching into a bag and pulling out something I couldn't make out. The others stood like sentinels, their posture tense and watchful. I stumbled backward, snapping a twig underfoot. The sound echoed through the forest, and all 3 heads snapped in my direction. For a moment, none of us moved. Then one of them took a step toward me, their face still hidden in shadow. I turned and ran. Branches clawed at my clothes and skin as I sprinted back to the road. My flashlight swung wildly, its beam dancing erratically. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and peeled out, the tires kicking up gravel. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, a tiny cluster of buildings with a single motel. I checked in and locked the door behind me, my mind racing. I debated calling the police but hesitated. What would I even tell them? That I'd seen some people around a fire in the woods? That a woman might be in trouble but had disappeared? The next morning, I left town without looking back. I took a different route, avoiding the detour entirely. I made it to the wedding, but I couldn't shake the memory of those figures in the forest or the woman's pale face. Even now, years later, I'm haunted by the questions I'll never have answers to. Sometimes the open road isn't as free as it seems.